Good evening. Welcome to today's point. I'm reporting from our international desk with an in-depth analysis of what many are calling a watershed moment in global diplomacy. President Lee Jae-myung of South Korea has concluded his first United Nations General Assembly participation since assuming the presidency following the dramatic political upheaval earlier this year. This 5-day diplomatic tour de force has sent ripples through the international community, redefined South Korea's position on the world stage, and exposed some uncomfortable truths about America's current leadership approach to multilateral cooperation. President Lee Jae-myung's arrival at JFK International Airport on September 22nd marked more than just another diplomatic visit. For the international community, this was the debut of a leader who had assumed power under unprecedented circumstances following the arrest and imprisonment of former President Yoon Suk-yeol on charges of leading an insurrection. The weight of legitimacy, the burden of national renewal, and the expectations of global partners all converged as Air Force One touched down in New York. The symbolism was not lost on seasoned diplomats who gathered at the UN headquarters. Here was a president representing what he would later call the return of democratic South Korea, a nation that had weathered one of its most severe constitutional crises in decades. International observers noted the careful choreography of Lee's arrival, the measured statements to the press, and the deliberate choice to begin his diplomatic offensive not at the UN but on Wall Street. In a move that surprised many diplomatic veterans, President Lee's first official engagement was not with fellow heads of state, but with Larry Fink, chairman and CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset management firm. This meeting at BlackRock's headquarters was far from ceremonial. It was a calculated demonstration of South Korea's pivot toward economic pragmatism in its foreign policy approach. The substance of this engagement revealed the sophistication of Lee's international strategy. Rather than simply seeking investment, Lee presented South Korea as the future AI capital of Asia, leveraging the nation's technological infrastructure, highly educated workforce, and strategic geographic position. Fink's response was immediate and enthusiastic, promising to mobilize global capital to support South Korea's artificial intelligence and renewable energy initiatives. What made this interaction particularly significant was its timing and context. While traditional diplomatic protocol might suggest beginning with bilateral meetings with allied nations, Lee chose to lead with economic substance. This decision sent a clear message to the international community. South Korea, under Lee Jae-myung, would prioritize tangible economic partnerships over ceremonial diplomatic gestures. European diplomats in particular took notice of this approach. A senior French official speaking on condition of anonymity described Lee's Wall Street gambit as refreshingly direct and noted that it demonstrated a business-minded pragmatism that European leaders find appealing in an era of economic uncertainty. The centerpiece of Lee's UN visit was undoubtedly his keynote address to the General Assembly on September 23rd. Standing before representatives of 193 nations, Lee delivered what many observers described as a masterclass in diplomatic messaging, combining historical gravitas with forward-looking vision. The speech's central theme was encapsulated in a single powerful acronym: END, representing exchange, normalization, and denuclearization. This framework represented a fundamental departure from the previous administration's hardline approach to North Korea and signaled South Korea's readiness to assume a leadership role in regional peacemaking. "We stand at the threshold of ending the era of hostility and confrontation on the Korean peninsula," Lee declared, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly hall. "Through comprehensive dialogue centered on exchange, relationship normalization, and denuclearization, we must open a new era of peaceful coexistence and shared growth." The reaction was immediate and telling. Diplomatic sources report that representatives from ASEAN nations responded with what one Indonesian diplomat described as visible relief at hearing a South Korean leader articulate a path toward de-escalation. European Union representatives were equally positive, with one EU official noting that Lee's approach aligned perfectly with the European preference for diplomatic solutions over military ones. Perhaps most significantly, the speech resonated strongly with developing nations that have grown weary of great power competition. A senior African diplomat observed that Lee's emphasis on shared growth and multilateral cooperation offered a refreshing alternative to the zero-sum approaches often associated with both American and Chinese foreign policy. The true diplomatic coup of Lee's visit came with his assumption of the UN Security Council presidency, a rotating position that South Korea held for September 2025. Lee became the first South Korean president to personally chair a Security Council session, presiding over discussions that included representatives from 80 nations. This historic moment was not merely ceremonial. Lee used his position to guide discussions on global security challenges with what observers described as remarkable skill and diplomatic finesse. His ability to navigate complex discussions between permanent Security Council members, particularly managing tensions between the United States, Russia, and China, drew praise from seasoned UN veterans. President Lee demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership the international community needs right now, commented a senior UN official who requested anonymity. He listened more than he spoke, facilitated rather than dominated, and found common ground where others see only division. The substantive outcome of these Security Council sessions included renewed commitments to multilateral approaches to regional conflicts and a framework for enhanced cooperation on cybersecurity threats, issues where South Korea's expertise proved invaluable. Beyond the high-profile public appearances, Lee's UN visit was marked by an intensive schedule of bilateral meetings that revealed the breadth of South Korea's diplomatic ambitions under his leadership. These weren't simply courtesy calls, they were strategic engagements designed to expand South Korea's influence in regions where it had previously maintained minimal presence. His meeting with President Mirziyoyev of Uzbekistan was particularly significant, opening new avenues for cooperation in Central Asia, a region where South Korea had previously ceded influence to larger powers. The discussions focused on technology transfer, infrastructure development, and educational partnerships, with both leaders signing preliminary agreements for enhanced cooperation. Similarly, Lee's meetings with Czech President Pavel and Polish President Duda represented a significant expansion of South Korea's engagement with Eastern Europe. These discussions went far beyond traditional trade relationships, encompassing cybersecurity cooperation, defense technology sharing, and joint initiatives in renewable energy. President Lee is clearly thinking beyond traditional alliance structures, observed a European diplomat familiar with the meetings. He's building a network of partnerships based on shared interests rather than inherited relationships. However, the most intriguing aspect of Lee's UN performance was the palpable discomfort it generated among American officials. Throughout the week, U.S. representatives displayed what can only be described as a pattern of petty obstructionism that was both surprising and revealing. The American reaction began with what appeared to be deliberate scheduling conflicts that prevented substantive bilateral meetings between Lee and senior U.S. officials. When meetings did occur, American representatives adopted what diplomatic sources described as an unexpectedly confrontational tone regarding South Korea's new approach to regional diplomacy. The tension reached its peak during Security Council sessions, where American representatives repeatedly interrupted Lee's efforts at consensus building with what observers characterized as unnecessarily aggressive interventions. This behavior stood in stark contrast to the collaborative approach displayed by other permanent Security Council members. The Americans seemed determined to assert dominance rather than engage constructively, noted a senior diplomat from a non-aligned nation. It was frankly embarrassing to watch a superpower behave so defensively. The underlying source of American irritation became clear through leaked diplomatic communications revealing a significant dispute over the $350 billion investment package previously negotiated in July. According to these sources, the United States has dramatically altered the terms of this agreement, demanding that South Korea convert the majority of these investments into direct cash transfers, effectively requiring South Korea to invest 80% of its foreign currency reserves directly into American markets. This demand represents a fundamental breach of the original agreement and has created what diplomatic sources describe as the most serious strain in U.S.-Korea relations in decades. The American position, articulated through unofficial channels, frames this demand as necessary for American economic security, a justification that has been met with incredulity by South Korean officials. President Lee's response to this pressure has been measured but firm. Speaking to Korean business leaders in New York, he stated that any investment arrangement must serve the mutual interests of both nations and cannot be a one-sided extraction of resources. The timing of this American demand, coinciding with Lee's successful UN debut, has not gone unnoticed by international observers. Many see it as an attempt to undermine Lee's growing international stature by creating economic pressure that would force South Korea back into a more subordinate relationship. Perhaps most damaging to American prestige during this UN session was the stark contrast between President Lee's forward-looking environmental policies and the regressive approach taken by the current U.S. administration. While Lee outlined South Korea's ambitious renewable energy initiatives and commitment to carbon neutrality, American representatives continued to promote policies that international experts describe as climate denialism. The American delegation's behavior during environmental discussions drew sharp criticism from multiple quarters. European representatives expressed frustration with what they characterized as willful ignorance of climate science, while developing nations questioned America's commitment to global cooperation on existential challenges. How can we take American leadership seriously when they refuse to acknowledge the most pressing challenge facing humanity? Asked a representative from a small island nation threatened by rising sea levels. President Lee talks about solutions while the Americans pretend the problem doesn't exist. This environmental stance has become particularly problematic given the growing global consensus on climate action. The American position, which includes withdrawal from key international climate agreements and active promotion of fossil fuel industries, increasingly isolates the United States from its traditional allies. The contrast became most apparent during a side event on renewable energy technology, where Lee outlined South Korea's plans to become carbon neutral by 2050 while investing heavily in next-generation clean technologies. The American response, delivered by a mid-level official, focused primarily on defending coal and oil industries, a position that drew visible discomfort even from traditionally pro-American allies. This has been our comprehensive analysis of President Lee Jae-myung's historic United Nations General Assembly participation. The implications of this diplomatic success will undoubtedly continue to unfold in the months ahead as South Korea assumes its new role as a leader in multilateral cooperation and global problem-solving. Thank you for watching. We'll continue to monitor these developing stories and their implications for international relations.